The winter of 1884 clamped down on Rotherhithe like a rusted vice. The Thames was sluggish and dark, its surface a skin of black water reflecting the faint orange of gas lamps along the dockside. This was the kind of winter where breath turned white in the air, then froze into the damp fabric of your scarf. Streets reeked of coal smoke and fish rot. Behind shuttered windows, people whispered of hunger and disease. But there was another whisper, quieter, colder, about a child who had never seen the sun yet could see more than any of them dared to. Her name was Eleanor Whitcomb. She lived, if one could call it that, beneath her father's blacksmith shop, a squat, brick-walled structure sagging under decades of soot and hammer blows. The cellar door was bolted from the outside. Neighbors said Thomas Whitcomb, a broad-shouldered man with hands like iron tongs, claimed the girl was light-sick and that sunlight would poison her. No one questioned it too loudly. Poverty was thick in Rotherhithe, and what a man did with his own kin behind closed doors was seldom the concern of anyone but God. When the parish finally sent a curate to investigate, the old man came back pale and silent, speaking only to say there was nothing to be done. That might have been the end of it, if not for the night Eleanor was seen walking in the snow. It was past midnight. The gas lamps on the street had gone out hours before, yet the child, barefoot in a threadbare nightdress, walked with perfect steadiness, stepping around rubbish, avoiding slick patches of ice as though she could see them. Witnesses swore her eyes were half closed, her gaze unfocused, and still she moved like she had memorized the earth beneath her feet. The next morning, Thomas claimed she'd never left her bed. But word traveled fast among the dockside workers, and soon the curiosity outgrew the fear. A group of locals came to the shop demanding to see her. Thomas refused. It took a constable 3 hammer blows to the lock and the stench of mildew before they finally found the cellar. It was a room the size of a pauper's coffin, 10 feet by 10, the air heavy with damp and metal. There were no windows. The walls were black with soot, and every inch bore strange circular burns overlapping like the ripples from stones dropped into still water. In the center was a bed frame of hammered iron, the mattress thin as paper. A single candle stub sat beside it, unlit, melted nearly to nothing. Eleanor sat on the bed, hands folded in her lap, her dark hair falling over her pale face. She didn't blink when the constable's lantern lit the room. She didn't flinch when a rat scurried along the wall behind her. Instead, she tilted her head slightly as though listening to something far away. When asked her name, she answered in a calm, clear voice that made the hairs on the back of every man's neck rise. "I already know why you've come," she said. The cellar was searched. There was no food, no basin, no chamber pot. Only the iron bed, the candle, and the strange markings scorched deep into the brick. Thomas was taken away shouting scripture about vision without light and the blessings of the blood. Eleanor was carried into the daylight for the first time in years. She buried her face in her hands, trembling as though the pale winter sun were burning her skin. The church took her in. The vicar wrote in his ledger that she was frail, underfed yet strangely composed. She navigated the rectory's unlit corridors with ease, never stumbling, never reaching out for a wall. At night, the staff would find her sitting motionless, eyes closed, murmuring to herself in a voice too low to understand. And yet the strangest thing was what happened to those who looked into her eyes for too long. One maid swore she saw fleeting images, a dock worker falling into the river, a carriage wheel splintering on cobblestone, a body laid out beneath a sheet. Another said she felt a coldness behind her ribs that lingered for hours. No one spoke of it openly. The parish called her a blessing. But blessings are not kept in windowless rooms. Blessings do not bear burn marks on the walls. And blessings do not tell you in perfect detail about something that hasn't happened yet. Eleanor was quiet, obedient, almost delicate in her manner. But behind that stillness was something methodical, something that did not belong to a child, a mind that had learned to navigate the dark and perhaps preferred it. Whatever her father had been teaching her in that cellar, it had not been for love. Soon the church would discover that Thomas Whitcomb's words, vision without light, were not just the ravings of a zealot. They were instructions. And Eleanor, whether she wanted to or not, would keep following them. The day after Eleanor was taken from the cellar, the constable returned with Inspector Arthur Vale, a man whose reputation in Southwark was built on stubborn patience. Vale was not quick to believe talk of miracles or curses. He preferred facts. Yet as he stood before the blacksmith's shop that morning, the air thick with coal dust, he could not shake the feeling that the building itself was holding its breath. Inside, the forge was still warm, the coals banked as though Thomas Whitcomb had stepped away for only a moment. The anvil stood in its place, worn smooth by decades of strikes. Yet it was not the workbench or tools that drew Vale's attention. It was the trapdoor in the far corner. The iron ring on its edge was blackened, the wood scarred by heat. When they pried it open, the stale cold air below seemed to rise with intent, as if it were aware of their intrusion. Vale descended with his lantern, boots crunching over something brittle. It took him a moment to realize the sound was coming from charred fragments scattered across the floor. Bits of bone, small enough to be mistaken for wood splinters. The brick walls were worse up close. The circular burns were deep, as though a hot iron had been pressed into the surface over and over. Each circle was perfect, too precise for accident, some no bigger than a coin, others wide enough to frame a face. The patterns overlapped until the walls seemed alive with concentric ripples frozen in place. In the far corner sat the iron bed frame, the thin mattress still indented by the weight of a child. Beside the bed lay a box no larger than a loaf of bread. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a stack of paper. The writing was fine, almost delicate, in a hand too disciplined for a child. Each page held only a short phrase, dates, locations, and sometimes a single name. Vale pocketed them uneasy. He would later admit that every time his lantern flame flickered across the pages, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Upstairs, the rest of the house offered no relief. There were no curtains. Every window had been painted black from the inside, layers of soot and pitch sealing out even the dim London daylight. In the kitchen, the shelves were bare except for jars of a thick red liquid that smelled faintly metallic. They were labeled only with numbers. Vale noted them, though he would not open one until much later, and then only once. Neighbors, drawn by curiosity, whispered in the doorway. A woman named Sarah Godwin, who lived across the lane, told Vale she had never seen Eleanor in the street, not once in all her 8 years. She claimed that sometimes at night she would hear a faint rhythmic sound from beneath the blacksmith's shop, like slow hammering, but lighter, steadier, almost like a pulse. When Vale asked if she had told anyone, Sarah hesitated before saying that people in Rotherhithe learned quickly which things not to notice. Those who noticed too much often found reason to leave, or vanished without the courtesy of explanation. By afternoon, the house was sealed. Thomas Whitcomb, still muttering scripture, was taken to a holding cell. Eleanor was kept in the rectory under watch. Vale, however, could not stop thinking about the cellar's circles, about the dates and names in that careful hand. Late that night he sat at his desk in the dim light of a single oil lamp and compared the list to recent parish death records. The first name matched. So did the second. By the fifth, his hands were slick with sweat. Every name, every date had already come to pass. And the final page held entries for days yet to come. The inspector leaned back, listening to the creak of the timbers in his small office. Somewhere outside, a cartwheel clattered against the cobblestones. He stared at the list, knowing he would not sleep. Because if a child raised in total darkness could see such things, the question was not how she saw them, but who had taught her, and why. The morning fog over Rotherhithe was heavy enough to swallow sound, turning the docks into a smudged outline of masts and chimney stacks. Inspector Vale carried the list of names in his coat pocket, its weight pressing against his ribs as though it had grown heavier overnight. The paper still smelled faintly of the cellar, of damp brick, burnt metal, and something older, almost sweet, like blood left too long in the air. At the parish archives, the clerk, a thin man with hollow cheeks, flinched when Vale asked for records on Thomas Whitcomb. The files arrived reluctantly. A single bound ledger, the spine cracked, the ink faded. It told a story the village had tried to forget. Years earlier, Thomas had been a devout member of St. Jude's Church, a regular at dawn prayer. Then came the sermons, not from the pulpit but whispered in alleys and behind the forge, about a second sight that did not come from God's light but from its absence. The church elders had called him in for questioning. Witnesses described the meeting as strained, the air charged with something unholy. One elder recalled Thomas speaking of vision without light as a path to purity, a stripping away of the world's false shapes until only truth remained. He insisted that the senses were liars, that sight was corrupted by light, and that true vision required the body to be emptied. Emptied. The word appeared over and over in the minutes of that meeting. Emptied of what? The elders had pressed him, but Thomas only smiled, quoting scripture in a way that made the words feel wrong in the mouth. When pressed further, he said the body could be trained to see through the blood, that the eyes were useless and that darkness could be sharpened into a blade. The church expelled him within the week, yet no charges were brought. The notes in the ledger ended with a single chilling line written by the vicar himself. It is better not to speak of what he believes. Vale left the parish office with the ledger under his arm, but his questions had only multiplied. If Thomas had been excommunicated, why had the parish allowed his daughter to remain in his care? Why had no one intervened? He decided to visit the last living elder who had attended that meeting. A woman named Margaret Prowell, now in her 70s, her back bent like a fishing hook. She lived in a narrow house near the shipyards. the smell of salt and tar clinging to its walls. When Vale explained his purpose, she shook her head slowly, her eyes clouded but still sharp enough to see the list he unfolded. She touched the paper as though it might burn her. "You think those names were predictions?" she said quietly. They weren't. They were instructions. Vale felt his stomach tighten. Margaret told him that Thomas had once spoken of an order. Not a formal one, not with robes or titles, but a chain of belief passed in whispers. They called themselves keepers of the veil. Their doctrine held that the living world was a sickness of light, and that the purest souls were those who had been unshaped by it. Children, she said, were easiest to train. "Train for what?" Vale asked. "To see what others cannot," she replied, "and to act on what they see." When he pressed her for details, Margaret's voice faltered. She admitted she had only heard fragments. Long hours in darkness, the sound of iron on flesh, the mingling of breath and blood. She had once seen Thomas carrying a small bundle into his forge at night, the bundle twitching in his arms. The next day he smelled of boiled bone. By the time Vale left, the fog had thickened, curling around the gas lamps in pale halos. The ledger in his coat felt heavier still, as though it were trying to anchor him to the cobblestones. Somewhere in the distance a ship's bell rang, low, slow, and hollow. He knew now that Eleanor's time in the cellar had been no accident of cruelty. It was part of something larger, something rooted not in madness but in belief. And belief, Vale thought grimly, was often the hardest thing to kill. The journal was found in the most unremarkable place, a false bottom in an old coal bin in the corner of the forge. Vale discovered it during a second, more meticulous search of the Whitcomb property. The book was bound in stiff, dark leather that had cracked with age, its edges stiff from soot. The pages smelled faintly of iron and oil. Some were filled with dense, technical writing in Thomas Whitcomb's steady hand, while others contained childlike sketches and notes scrawled in ink that wavered as if written by an unsteady grip. The first section was methodical. Measurements, durations, and a record of sessions in a place Thomas called the Black Room. It was not the cellar. Vale knew that immediately. The description matched nothing in the house. This was a constructed space with walls of layered brick, lined inside with hammered sheets of iron. A double door ensured that no light, not even the faintest glow, could penetrate. The room was soundproofed with thick wool soaked in an unknown resin. Ventilation was narrow and slow, making the air heavy within minutes. Thomas's notes detailed precise routines. Eleanor would be placed inside for hours at a time, then for entire nights. He described it clinically as if writing about a machine. "Subject responds well to incremental deprivation," one entry read. Another, "Reduction of stimulus sharpens internal sight. Limit food to 1 meal every 2 days to prevent energy dissipation." The child's own notes appeared later, hidden between her father's diagrams. Written in an uneven but strangely neat script, they were far more disturbing. She referred to the Black Room as her quiet place. She described seeing with the blood, a phrase repeated in various contexts. She wrote about game, though the word felt wrong, in which she was told to close her eyes and follow the warmth until she could describe objects that were never in the room with her. One entry stood out. "When the ringing stops, the shapes come. They are red, even in the dark. Father says the red is mine and that I must keep it warm. Vale realized with a tightening in his chest that she was describing the sound of her own heartbeat, and that the red was her blood. Deeper into the journal, the experiments became more invasive. There were sketches of a chair fitted with leather straps and a copper basin beneath it. Notes described measured blood extraction, followed by prolonged darkness and stillness. The theory, according to Thomas, was that with each letting, Eleanor's dependency on her eyes would weaken, forcing her mind to create images from within. Vale closed the journal more than once while reading, each time needing to steady his hands before he could continue. It wasn't only cruelty, it was precision. Every act was calculated, repeated, and refined over years. This was not a father punishing a child. This was a man engineering her. The most unsettling entries were not Thomas's at all, but Eleanor's. She wrote of moments when, in total blackness, she could see things happening far away. A lantern being dropped on a dock, a woman tripping in snow, a chimney collapsing in the night. She described them with a clarity that made Vale uneasy, especially when he compared her descriptions to incidents in old constabulary reports. They matched, down to details that had never been public. One drawing chilled him more than any of the words. It showed a rough floor plan of the black room, but in the center she had sketched a figure. Not her father, not herself, but something faceless standing in the darkness with her. Next to it she had written, "It whispers when father is gone. It tells me what to write." By the time Vale finished the journal, the oil lamp on his desk was sputtering low. He felt the heat from the flame, but it offered no comfort. The black room had been a crucible, shaping a child into something beyond his understanding. Whatever she had learned there, she had carried with her into the church, into the asylum, into every shadow she walked through. The last page of Thomas's writing was dated just a week before his death. It read simply, "The work is nearly complete. Soon she will see without me." Vale sat back in his chair, the journal heavy in his hands. Somewhere out there, Eleanor had already entered the next phase of her life. And if the black room had been only the beginning, he feared what the next phase might demand of her. The day after Thomas Whitcomb's body was found in the forge, charred so completely that even the coroner struggled to say where the man ended and the ash began, Eleanor was declared a ward of the parish. She did not weep when told of her father's death. She simply lowered her head and murmured, "It was time." Those present disagreed on whether she meant it as grief, relief, or something colder. The church could not keep her indefinitely. Within a fortnight, she was sent to the Whitmore Asylum for Girls, a tall gray edifice on the edge of Southwark. The building loomed like a cliff face over its courtyard, its barred windows reflecting the winter sky in dull streaks. Founded under the banner of Christian charity, Whitmore's reputation was one of strict discipline wrapped in the language of care. The matron, Mrs. Augusta Haldane, met Eleanor at the door. She was a woman whose smile began and ended with her mouth, her eyes perpetually assessing. She made a show of bending down to Eleanor's level, brushing hair from the girl's face, and remarking on how fine and delicate her features were. That night, Eleanor was given a narrow bed in a dormitory of 16 other girls. But while they slept, she sat awake, hands resting lightly on the blanket. her head tilted toward the darkness as though listening for something. The first signs of her gift emerged within days. During morning assembly, Mrs. Haldane noticed Eleanor staring toward the far end of the hall. When asked what she saw, Eleanor quietly replied that one of the seamstresses, Miss Fairley, would not finish her mending today because her hands would be full of glass. An hour later, a messenger arrived to say Miss Fairley had tripped carrying a jar of preserved pears. The glass had shattered in her hands. Word traveled quickly within Whitmore's walls. Soon the director himself, Dr. Horace Willoughby, took an interest. A portly man with an impeccable beard and an appetite for reputation, Willoughby saw in Eleanor an opportunity. Publicly, he spoke of her as a miraculous child touched by Providence. Privately, he began arranging controlled tests. At first, they were innocent enough. Objects placed in sealed boxes, locked drawers, covered baskets. Eleanor would describe them without hesitation. She never guessed. She simply stated facts, her voice flat, her answers always correct. The staff marveled, but accuracy was not enough for Willoughby. He began introducing time into the trials, asking her what would happen in the courtyard that afternoon, or who might visit the asylum gates before the day was out. Her responses were as calm and precise as if she had already seen it all. The more she succeeded, the more the tests changed. The objects were no longer trinkets or tools, they became personal items taken from the staff. A ring hidden in a nurse's apron pocket, a letter locked in the head gardener's drawer. Eleanor always knew. Willoughby began keeping her in a darkened room for hours before each test, claiming it focused her abilities. The other girls grew wary of her. Some avoided her altogether, muttering that she brought bad luck. Others watched her with a kind of fascinated fear, unsure whether she was a victim or something else entirely. Eleanor neither sought nor avoided their company. She seemed to live in two worlds, the one they all shared and another that was sealed off where only she could walk. On Sundays, visitors from the parish came to hear her speak. They asked about their missing jewelry, their misplaced keys, the weather for the week ahead. Eleanor answered each question without expression, her pale face catching the lamplight like porcelain. Willoughby beamed at her side, the proud keeper of a living wonder. But Vale, who had secured permission to observe, saw something else. He noticed the faint tremor in her hands after each session, the way she sometimes blinked rapidly when brought back into the light as though it hurt. He noticed the marks on her forearms, tiny, neat punctures in the skin. And he recognized in the careful way Willoughby logged her sessions the same cold precision he had seen in Thomas Whitcomb's journal. Eleanor had not been freed from the black room. It had simply changed shape. By the spring of 1885, the Whitmore Asylum for Girls had quietly become less a home for orphans than a laboratory for one. Dr. Horace Willoughby's interest in Eleanor Whitcomb had hardened into obsession. In his private notes, never meant for parish eyes, he no longer referred to her by name. She was Subject E. He wrote about her as one might write about a rare specimen, noting her endurance, her adaptability, and most of all, her exceptional sensitivity to absence. The experiments shifted in tone and purpose. Darkness was no longer merely the environment. It became the medium, the tool through which Willoughby believed he could sharpen her abilities to an unnatural edge. The small storage room he used for her preparation sessions was stripped of every object and lined with heavy wool panels. Lamps were removed, the single window bricked over. The only sound came from the slow tick of a wall clock, muffled until it felt like it was ticking inside the skull. But it was the bloodletting that marked the change from curiosity to cruelty. Willoughby introduced it gradually, a small prick to the fingertip at first, then a measured draw from the arm. He claimed it reduced sensory clutter, forcing the body to conserve energy by heightening other faculties. Eleanor never resisted. She sat still, her eyes closed as if she were already somewhere else. Over time, the volumes increased. Willoughby bled her in controlled quantities, then left her in the sealed room for hours, sometimes overnight. When she emerged, pale and trembling, her responses during the trials were sharper, quicker, more vivid. She could describe the contents of a locked desk drawer in another building, the movements of a man walking past the asylum gates, the precise moment a nurse would knock over a jug in the infirmary. Willoughby recorded each success with a triumphant flourish. But the side effects became harder to ignore. Eleanor began avoiding daylight entirely. Even the dim gaslight in the dining hall made her flinch. Her pupils pinpricks in the glow. She developed a habit of pressing her hands to her temples as if steadying something inside her head. And there were moments, fleeting, but witnessed by more than one staff member, when she would speak unprompted, murmuring details about events far beyond the asylum walls. One nurse swore that during a quiet morning in the laundry, Eleanor suddenly whispered that a cart was overturning on Borough High Street. An hour later, a delivery man staggered into the asylum courtyard with blood on his forehead, seeking help. The incident never made it into Willoughby's official reports, but it fueled whispers among the staff. Inspector Vale visited whenever his duties allowed. He found Willoughby's methods abhorrent but could prove nothing. The doctor framed every act as medical advancement, claiming Eleanor was fragile and needed preparation for her talents to function. The inspector confronted him once in the corridor, asking if he considered the girl's welfare. Willoughby replied without hesitation, "Her welfare is the work." The breaking point came one winter evening when Vale arrived unannounced. He followed the faint sound of dripping to the preparation room and found the door unlocked. Inside, Eleanor sat on a wooden chair, her bare feet resting in a shallow copper basin. The water was tinted red. Her arms were loosely bound to the chair's arms, not in cruelty, but to prevent her from slumping. Her face was calm, her breathing slow. In her lap rested a slate on which she had written 5 names in neat block letters. Vale demanded an explanation. Willoughby claimed it was an advanced exercise, nothing more. But the inspector's eyes kept returning to the slate. 3 of the names were already familiar from the obituaries in his weekly paper. When Eleanor was released from the chair, she avoided Vale's gaze. As she walked past him into the dim corridor, she whispered, so faintly he thought he might have imagined it, "They never asked if I wanted to see." The Red Vision trials, as Vale would later call them in his own hidden notes, continued for months. The more blood she lost, the less she belonged to daylight. She became a creature of shadow, her world narrowing to the blackness behind her eyelids. And somewhere in that blackness, she was learning things that no one had the right to know. By the autumn of 1886, the darkened storage room at Whitmore was no longer enough for Dr. Horace Willoughby. He had exhausted what could be drawn from silence and blood alone. His notes shifted focus, speaking now of suspension and threshold states, conditions in which the body teetered between life and death, forcing the mind to seek new paths. The solution, in his mind, was water. The drowning room lay in the oldest part of the asylum's cellar, built decades earlier as a laundry cistern. It was a circular chamber, its walls slick with lime, the ceiling low enough to make every sound echo twice. At the center sat a pool 10 feet across, its surface black in the lamplight. The water came from an underground channel and was always bitterly cold, carrying the metallic tang of the earth. In the middle of the pool, fixed to the floor with iron bolts, was a narrow pillar topped with a low wooden platform, just big enough for a child to kneel upon. Chains ran from the pillar to the walls, their ends fitted with leather straps. Eleanor was brought here first under the pretext of acclimation. She was told to stand on the platform while Willoughby took notes on her balance, her breathing. But it was only a matter of visits before the straps were fastened to her wrists and ankles. She did not cry. She asked no questions. The drowning was never sudden. The process was slow, methodical. The platform would be tilted forward until Eleanor slipped into the freezing water, the chains allowing just enough slack for her to surface, but never enough to climb free. She was instructed to hold herself still, to breathe slowly, to let the water carry the weight of her body. At first, the sessions lasted minutes. Then they lengthened, creeping toward hours. Willoughby's theory was that as her body fought to retain heat and air, her mind would detach from its physical panic, allowing her vision to sharpen. And according to his records, it worked. Emerging from the pool, teeth chattering, lips blue, Eleanor would speak in quick bursts, describing events far outside the asylum walls. A carriage accident in Deptford, a woman collapsing on the steps of St. Paul's, a chimney fire in Bermondsey, each verified in the days that followed. Other staff began to take notice. A young nurse, Miss Havers, once caught a glimpse of the drowning room during a session. She told Vale later that the sight had stayed with her like a bruise on the mind. The pale child suspended between the dark water and the dim ceiling, her face blank, her eyes half closed, her hair fanned out in the current. She said it looked less like cruelty than like a ritual, as if the water itself were being asked to claim her. Vale confronted Willoughby again, but the doctor's confidence was absolute. "Fear is the last veil," he said. "Remove it and the sight becomes pure." Vale could not arrest him without cause, and in the eyes of the parish board, Eleanor was thriving. She was healthy enough to stand, coherent enough to speak, and producing results that no one dared question too closely. The sessions grew stranger. Sometimes Eleanor would refuse to speak for hours after leaving the water, sitting wrapped in blankets, her lips moving silently as though conversing with someone unseen. On one such evening, Vale visited her in the infirmary. She looked at him with pupils so dilated they swallowed almost all the color of her eyes and said, "It's not always me who comes back." The remark haunted him. He began to suspect that the drowning was not merely altering her senses, but changing something more fundamental. And yet, like everyone else, he found himself waiting for her next prediction. unable to look away from the quiet horror of her certainty. The drowning room remained in use for nearly a year. By the time it was sealed, officially due to structural damp, Eleanor's abilities had moved beyond simple foresight. She no longer needed to be asked questions. She simply began speaking, her words arriving like a list written elsewhere and delivered through her mouth. When the chains were finally removed from the chamber, their leather cuffs were worn smooth from the constant pressure of a child's wrists. The water in the pool had gone cloudy, as though it had absorbed what was done there and would never again run clear. The first name appeared in chalk on the wall of Eleanor's dormitory. It was written in her careful block letters just above her bed frame. John Mercer. No one saw her write it. The other girls whispered that it had been there when they woke. 2 days later, word reached the asylum that John Mercer, a dock foreman in Bermondsey, had been crushed beneath a falling crate. It could have been dismissed as a morbid coincidence until the second name appeared, then the third. Within weeks, the list had grown to 7. Each name belonged to someone local enough for news of their sudden, violent deaths to reach the asylum. The staff began erasing the chalk as soon as they saw it, but the names returned, sometimes in the dormitory, sometimes scratched into the underside of a desk, sometimes on the inside of a locked cupboard door. Dr. Willoughby stopped trying to hide them from Inspector Vale. In his mind, this was proof of Eleanor's advancement, a sign that her sight was now self-directing, no longer dependent on prompts. Vale saw something darker, not the mechanical output of a trained subject, but the deliberate marking of lives for an end she understood and accepted. The count grew steadily, each entry matched by a corresponding obituary or constable's report. All 42 would be dead within 3 months. Their ends were varied, drowning in the Thames, being struck by a runaway horse, tumbling down cellar stairs. But all shared a cruel inevitability. Not a single one survived beyond the date Eleanor had scrawled beside their name. When Vale questioned her directly, Eleanor never claimed responsibility. She only stated in her even, unhurried voice that these were the ones who could not stay. She did not elaborate. He asked if someone had told her the names. She replied, "No. I see them when I close my eyes. I see what happens after they stop breathing." The atmosphere inside Whitmore shifted. Staff members who had once been curious about her now avoided her gaze. A kitchen maid refused to enter the dining hall if Eleanor was there, swearing the girl had whispered her brother's name in the corridor. When pressed, Eleanor denied it. But 3 weeks later, the brother's body was pulled from the river. Willoughby, meanwhile, began cataloging the names in his own ledger, tracing patterns in their occupations, their addresses, their known associates. He believed the list was revealing some unseen structure in London's social fabric, a pattern only Eleanor could detect. He spoke of urban culling and purification cycles in ways that made even his senior staff uneasy. Vale's visits became more frequent. He sat with Eleanor in the darkened preparation room, trying to steer the conversation toward choice, toward morality. She listened politely but seemed unmoved. One afternoon, when he asked if she wanted the visions to stop, she tilted her head and said, "If they stop, I'll be alone in the dark. If they stay, I'm never alone." By the time the 42nd name appeared, Anne Whitlow, a washerwoman from Deptford, Even Willoughby sensed a conclusion approaching. Anne was struck in the temple by a falling clothesline pulley 3 days later. Eleanor did not mark another name. She returned to her quiet routines as though the work were finished. But Vale couldn't leave it at that. He obtained copies of all 42 names and dates, comparing them to the list found in Thomas Whitcomb's forge. 18 matched exactly. Same names, same order, same endings. It was not new sight Eleanor possessed, but inherited sight. The work had begun in the cellar years before, and now it had been completed. The realization made his skin crawl. If these were instructions, not predictions, then Eleanor was not a seer, but a keeper of a ledger whose entries could not be erased. Somewhere in the shadows, the doctrine of silence and the tools of the Black Room were still shaping her, and Vale suspected they were not finished. In December of 1887, the Whitmore Asylum held its annual Benefactors' Night, a winter gathering meant to impress the wealthy donors whose patronage kept the institution's doors open. The event was usually a polite affair, a modest supper, a tour of the dormitories, a sermon from the parish chaplain, and the presentation of the girls' needlework. But that year, Dr. Horace Willoughby planned something different, something unforgettable. The invitations were written in gold ink on heavy cream paper, promising a demonstration of unprecedented scientific and spiritual significance. The guests arrived in fur-lined coats, their carriages steaming in the cold air, eager for spectacle. They were ushered into the asylum's great hall, its tall windows draped in black velvet, candles flickering in tall iron sconces. A long table was set with bread, wine, and roasted meats. But there was no sign of the girls. When the dinner plates were cleared, Willoughby rose to speak. His words were honeyed, praising the generosity of those present, then turning to the matter of a singular young resident whose gifts defy earthly explanation. At his signal, 2 attendants opened the far doors. Eleanor entered barefoot, dressed in a simple gray gown. Her skin was almost translucent in the candlelight, her dark hair loose over her shoulders. She did not look at the audience. The center of the hall had been cleared for a single wooden chair, placed within a ring of unlit lamps. Eleanor was guided to the chair and seated. A basin of water was brought to her feet. Beside it on a small table lay a thin steel blade and a folded square of linen. Willoughby explained to the guests that light was an obstacle to Eleanor's sight, that she must be prepared for the vision state. At his nod, an attendant pricked her fingertip and let the blood fall into the basin, drop by deliberate drop. The room was silent but for the sound of liquid meeting liquid. Eleanor did not flinch. Then the lamps were extinguished one by one until the hall was in complete darkness. The guests shifted in their seats, some nervously, some with the thrill of curiosity. In the blackness, Eleanor began to speak. Her voice was soft but carried across the hall, naming people, not those in the room but acquaintances, family members, servants of the benefactors. With each name came a description: an accident, an illness, a sudden collapse in the street. Some in the audience gasped, recognizing the details. Others whispered that this was theater, a parlor trick dressed in solemnity. But Willoughby stood at the edge of the circle, beaming in the dark, every name spoken like a coin dropping into his coffer. The performance lasted nearly an hour. By the end, Eleanor's voice was hoarse and the smell of blood hung faintly in the air. When the lamps were relit, the basin at her feet was dark with diluted red, her hands resting limply in her lap. A few guests applauded hesitantly, others avoided looking at her. One woman, a baroness known for her influence in the parish, approached Eleanor, knelt, and asked in a low voice if her own name was among those the girl had not spoken aloud. Eleanor's eyes, still dilated from the darkness, met hers. "Yes," she said simply. The baroness did not stay for the final prayers. Vale, who had come as an invited observer, left the hall before the feast resumed. In his mind, the event had stripped away any pretense of care or charity. This was not research. It was theater. A child's suffering packaged for the appetites of those rich enough to believe themselves immune. He suspected the guests who pretended to doubt her would be the same ones checking their own names against the obituaries in the weeks to come. That night the long table was reset, the candles relit, and the benefactors dined well. In a small side room, Eleanor sat alone, her bloodied basin beside her, the linen pressed to her fingertip. She asked no questions and made no demands. She simply closed her eyes and tilted her head slightly as if listening for the next name. Willoughby's ledger entry for the evening was concise, demonstration successful, audience receptive, subjects output unimpeded by presence of strangers, increased stamina observed under bloodletting conditions. There was no mention of her pallor, the tremor in her legs, or the way her breath had quickened when the lights went out. Details Vale could not forget. Outside, the frost thickened on the asylum's windows. Somewhere beyond them, the city moved in ignorance, unaware that within those black-draped walls a girl was being shaped into something no longer wholly human. Her worth measured not in the hours of her life, but in the precision of her visions. The fire began on a windless night in January 1892, when the air in Southwark was so still that even the smoke from the factory chimneys seemed reluctant to rise. Inside Whitmore Asylum, the halls were quiet. The girls were locked in their dormitories, the staff retreating to their own quarters. Only the faint ticking of the wall clock and the groan of settling timbers disturbed the silence. The first shout came from the western wing. A nurse on night duty smelled it before she saw it. The sharp, acrid scent of burning wool. By the time she reached the corridor, smoke was pushing through the seams of the preparation room door. The wool-lined walls, meant to muffle sound and block light, had caught like dry tinder. Panic spread faster than the flames. The asylum had been built for containment, not escape. Doors locked from the outside, windows barred, stairwells narrow enough to choke the rush of fleeing bodies. Within minutes, the western wing was an orange furnace, its heat bending the air. Some claimed later that they saw Eleanor walking calmly through the smoke before the alarm was fully raised. Her gray gown brushing the floor, her hair lit at the edges by the fire's glow. She did not run. She did not call out. She simply moved with purpose toward the main hall, where the great doors stood closed. Vale was in Southwark on unrelated business when the bells began ringing. By the time he reached Whitmore, the fire had swallowed half the building. Flames licked the sky, the heat striking him like a wall. The air was thick with the sound of screams. Some close, some muffled behind the barred windows. He joined the men trying to force the main doors, the wood blistering under their hands. When the doors finally gave, the great hall was a black haze, lit only by the glow from the burning wings. And there, near the center of the room, stood Eleanor. Her eyes were closed, her face smeared with soot. She was barefoot, her feet blackened with ash. In her hands she carried nothing, not a single possession, not even the blanket draped around some of the other girls. Vale took her by the arm, guiding her out into the cold air. She offered no resistance, but she did not thank him either. When asked what had happened, she gave a single answer: "They saw what I see now." Of the 46 girls housed at Whitmore that winter, only 19 made it out alive. The rest were either consumed by the fire or trapped behind doors that could not be opened in time. Willoughby's body was never officially identified, though some insisted his was one of the charred remains found in the western wing. Others whispered he had escaped into the night, ledger in hand. The fire brigade, after days of sifting through the ruins, declared the blaze accidental, the result of a tipped oil lamp in a storage room. Vale did not believe it. The preparation room where the fire had started was one Eleanor knew well, and the fact that she had been found alone, uninjured, with no sign of panic, gnawed at him. In the weeks that followed, the surviving girls were placed in other institutions. Eleanor did not join them. She vanished from the official record, her name omitted from the relocation lists. Vale made inquiries, but the answers were vague. Some said she had been claimed by a distant relative, others that she had been moved to a private residence for special care. All he knew for certain was that the girl who had been shaped in darkness, who had written the names of the dead before their time, was now somewhere in the world without the walls of Whitmore around her. And if she had carried her visions out into the open, the fire had not ended the work. It had set it loose. After the Whitmore fire, Eleanor Whitcomb seemed to dissolve into the fog of London, as though the city had swallowed her whole. No official placement records, no parish custody notes, no trace in the court archives. It was as if she had never existed at all. Vale suspected otherwise. Rumor eventually led him to the outskirts of Kent, to a shuttered farmhouse crouched low against the wind. It belonged to a widow named Agnes Crowthorne, a reclusive figure known in the village for buying large amounts of lamp oil and never attending church. Her husband had died years earlier, crushed in a quarry collapse, leaving her with a modest pension and no children. Through questions whispered at the local inn, Vale learned that a thin, pale girl had been seen at the farmhouse now and then, usually at dusk. She never came into the village. Delivery boys claimed that when they left parcels on the step, the door would open only wide enough for a single pale hand to take them in. For nearly 20 years, this was Eleanor's life, hidden behind drawn curtains, her days spent in rooms where the air never saw the sun. Visitors spoke of odd disturbances when they approached the house. Clocks that stopped the moment they stepped inside, dogs that refused to cross the threshold, the sensation of being watched in absolute darkness. One man swore he had seen her silhouette behind an upstairs window at night, unmoving for hours, head slightly tilted as if listening to something beyond the walls. Agnes Crowthorne never denied the girl's presence, but she would only say that Eleanor was not fit for the daylight. Vale visited once, years after the fire. He found Agnes polite but guarded, her answers tight, her gaze steady. Eleanor did not appear, though he felt certain she was nearby. In the dim parlor, a teacup sat on the mantel, still warm with a faint smear of red on its rim. Occasionally, reports filtered back to him of odd happenings in neighboring villages. Sudden deaths preceded by a stranger's quiet arrival. Family heirlooms found missing only to turn up days later in locked rooms, accidents that seemed too precisely timed to be chance. When Vale traced the dates, they aligned eerily with known visits of Agnes's supply carts into town. By the time the century turned, Eleanor was in her 30s, though no one who spoke of her could say they had seen her clearly. Some insisted she had not aged at all. Others claimed her hair had gone white, her skin almost translucent. Vale could never confirm either. What he did know was this: the darkness she had been shaped in at Whitmore had not loosened its hold. It had only deepened, settling into her like marrow in bone. And somewhere in that shuttered farmhouse, she was still seeing what others could not, and perhaps still deciding who could remain in the light and who could not. In the spring of 1913, after more than 2 decades in obscurity, Eleanor Whitcomb emerged from the shadows. The invitation came from Cambridge, a group of researchers in experimental psychology who had heard whispers of a woman who could see without light. They framed it as science, not spectacle, promising controlled conditions, humane treatment, and most persuasively, privacy. Agnes Crowthorne accompanied her to the university's underground laboratory. The space was newly built, a chamber sunk deep into the earth. Its walls lined with soundproof panels, its entrance guarded by 2 heavy steel doors. There were no windows, no ventilation shafts to admit even the faintest sliver of day. The scientists called it the sensory isolation suite. Eleanor called it familiar. The protocol was simple: 3 days alone in total darkness with no sound, no contact, and minimal sustenance. On the 4th day, she would emerge and describe any events she had perceived beyond the chamber walls. Vale, now graying and working in a minor constabulary post, secured permission to observe. She entered without hesitation. The steel doors closed, and the world outside the chamber forgot her. On the morning of the 4th day, Eleanor was led out, pale but steady, her pupils wide as coins. Without being prompted, she began to speak. A list of names, each paired with the exact date, location, and cause of death. The scientists recorded them in silence. Vale recognized 2 of the names immediately, both belonging to men in the room. Within 5 years, every one of her predictions had come to pass. Not one was wrong. The researchers published a carefully sanitized report, omitting the more unsettling details. Her refusal to eat during the experiment, the way she would smile faintly in the darkness, as if someone were there with her. The public never knew her name. Cambridge sealed the raw notes, citing ethical concerns, and Eleanor returned with Agnes to the farmhouse. Vale never saw her again, but when news reached him of her death in 1932, he felt a cold certainty. Whatever she had been trained to see had not died with her. It had only changed eyes. Eleanor Whitcomb died quietly in the upstairs bedroom of the shuttered Kent farmhouse on a wet October evening in 1932. The death certificate, signed by a reluctant village doctor, listed heart failure as the cause. There was no autopsy, no parish service, and only 2 attendees at the burial, Agnes Crowthorne and the gravedigger. The coffin was lowered into an unmarked grave at the far edge of the churchyard, where the grass grew taller than the stones. Agnes returned to the farmhouse alone. She survived Eleanor by barely 6 months, dying of pneumonia in the winter. With no heirs, the property passed to the crown. When officials arrived to inventory the estate, they found most of the rooms bare, the furniture draped in yellowed sheets. Every curtain remained drawn. The air was heavy with the smell of old dust and lamp oil. It was in the smallest bedroom, the one with no windows at all, that they found the trunk. It was squat, made of blackened oak and banded in tarnished brass. The lock was intricate, a design no one recognized. When a locksmith was summoned from the village, he examined it in silence for nearly an hour before producing a set of fine tools from a leather pouch. The lock opened with a reluctant click, as if it had not been turned in decades. Inside, the first impression was of paper. Neat stacks of folded sheets, each labeled in the same small, precise handwriting Vale remembered from the cellar of Thomas Whitcomb's forge. But beneath the papers lay something far stranger. Glass jars, each no larger than a fist, their lids sealed with layers of wax. The contents were unmistakable. Dried blood, dark as rust. Each jar bore a label with a name and a date written in that same unwavering script. There were dozens of them. Some names matched those on the 42 list from Whitmore. Others were new to Vale, who had been summoned to inspect the find. He felt an icy pull as he lifted the jars, one after another, recognizing the occasional date as belonging to accidents or sudden deaths he had once investigated. The papers were no less unsettling. Many contained sketches, floor plans, street layouts, detailed diagrams of rooms Vale had never seen. Others were lists, each name accompanied by terse annotations: slipped, struck, water, fever. There was no sign of how the blood had been taken, no hint of what purpose it had served. But the orderliness, the ritual precision, was unmistakable. Vale ordered that the trunk and its contents be removed under police seal. Officially, the items were to be logged and stored at the parish records office. Unofficially, he knew they would never be displayed. The vicar, pale after his first look inside, quietly suggested burial. Within a week, the jars and papers were interred in an unmarked pit behind the church, the earth tamped flat, no marker left to show the place. Still, Vale kept one paper, a single folded sheet taken from the trunk before the burial. It bore no name, only a date. October 18th, 1932. The day of Eleanor's death. Beneath the date was a single sentence in that same small, steady script. The darkness is never empty. He never showed it to anyone. But in the years that followed, whenever a case crossed his desk involving a sudden, improbable death, he found himself thinking of the trunk, of the jars, of the girl who had learned to see without light. And he wondered, with a heaviness that no retirement could shake, whether some other pair of eyes had inherited her sight and her ledger. In the years after Eleanor Whitcomb's death, her name faded from public memory. There were no plaques, no memorials, no mention in parish histories. But among a thin chain of people, constables, archivists, and the last surviving staff from Whitmore, her story remained a quiet, unshakable presence. The sealed records of the Whitmore Asylum fire were opened briefly in 1956 under a revision of public archive law. For a few weeks, journalists sifted through yellowed reports and charred photographs, piecing together the official narrative: an accidental blaze, a tragic loss of life, and a gifted orphan who vanished afterward. But buried deeper in the files, for those who knew where to look, were the unredacted notes of Dr. Horace Willoughby and Inspector Arthur Vale, documents that told a different story. The press printed only fragments. An article in the Southwark Gazette mentioned experimental sensory trials on children and hinted at the existence of a ledger of names tied to unexplained deaths. But without photographs, without living witnesses willing to speak, the story slipped quietly off the front page. No inquiry followed, no charges were ever reconsidered. In Rotherhithe, the house where Thomas Whitcomb's forge once stood had long since been torn down, replaced by a row of flats. Yet locals still spoke in guarded tones of a girl who could walk through darkness as if it were daylight. Some claimed that in rare moments when the river fog was thick enough to blot out the gas lamps, they had seen her shape moving along the embankment. The same slow, measured pace described by witnesses nearly 50 years earlier. For Vale, who lived into his 80s, the story never ended. The folded page he had taken from Eleanor's trunk, the one with the words "The darkness is never empty," remained in his desk until the day he died. It passed to his daughter, who reportedly burned it without reading. She told neighbors she didn't want whatever was on that paper in the house. The legacy of Eleanor Whitcomb was not in memorials or archives, but in a lingering unease, the quiet suspicion that some knowledge is meant to remain hidden, and that cruelty wrapped in the language of science or faith can pass unnoticed for decades if it wears a calm face. Laws eventually tightened on experimental trials, especially on minors, but they came too late for her. And so the question remains, whispered in late-night conversations or asked silently when the power goes out and the room is truly dark. If someone could see without light, if they could know what would happen before it did, would they use it to save or to mark who would be lost? In the end, perhaps Eleanor's greatest lesson was not in what she saw, but in how silently evil can move, shaping the world in small, precise steps until it no longer needs to hide. What do you think? Could this happen again?